Hey everyone, and welcome back to Build UX. In this episode, we're going to finish recreating the design and then also think about how we can start componentizing the UI. All of this work will anticipate the light UI variation of the designs, and that way we can anticipate having theming support when it comes time to develop this project. With where we left off in the last episode, we finished recreating the icons that we see throughout the design. And I think it's a good time to finish recreating the design by adding in the remaining avatar icons and some of the pop-outs for the tooltips, as well as getting our box shadows established to kind of determine different elevations in the design. So here in the layers, I just pulled the reference up top, and this will allow us to quickly diff between the reference and our recreated design. And let's turn our attention to finalizing things component by component. So we'll start off with this header section up top, and it looks like we still need to add this avatar up here. So I'm going to quickly turn off a couple layers and actually show the reference below, just so we can build directly on top of it. Let's zoom in here and hit R for the rectangle tool and drag out a rectangle that matches the dimensions of the design. So we'll quickly establish the width and height we need here. Looks like it's 48 by 48, which is a good value for us to work with. And let's adjust the border radius so it has this slight elliptical feel to it. So it looks like 18 pixels is a good match there. So looking at our layer names, we had username for Charlie Grant here. Let's maybe rename this to be the profile. We'll say it's the username. And then this new rectangle shape we can say is the profile. Let's call it the user avatar. And we'll make sure to drag that to come just before the username in the layer stack. All right, so with that in place, let's continue going through our design here and see what else remains. I think for the most part, things are pretty settled with the actual inbox section of our design. So let's move into the message detail area. So opening up the message detail group, it looks like we need to start adding avatars for the sender as well as all of the recipients in the recipient list. And then we can also add this tooltip that pops out when you hover over the recipients. So going into the current message, I'm going to drag out another rectangle for this sender avatar. And hopefully it matches in dimension to what we saw above with 48 by 48, which it does. Let's get that same border radius established. I think that was 18 pixels. That's looking correct. And we're going to add a stroke to the outside of this shape. And it looks like it's a 2 pixel stroke. And I'm going to select this shape and hold shift and the arrow key to bump it down by 10 pixels. And this is just so we can color sample the stroke with what we see in our design. We're going to hold off applying images in this design for now, but when it comes time to actually develop this, we'll want to make sure we have nice avatars for the users, as well as any symbols we need for the Dribbble team sender in our messages. Okay, let's tackle these recipients here. Again, similar process. Let's just drag out a rectangle. I'm going to first recreate off this one that is not obscured and go for the inner dimension of the image here. That's looking good, 26 by 26. Let's figure out what border radius we have. Things are just shy of being completely circular in theme with the rest of the UI we see here. Let's add that stroke. Remember, it's on the outside, and I think it's just a 1 pixel stroke. Yep, 1 pixel looks correct there. Again, we're going to shift this down and color sample the outline that we need. Put that back in place, and we'll start dragging out instances of this that roughly match our design. Again, we're going to worry about spacing here once we start componentizing everything. So it looks like we need this third one to stack on top of the rest. While we're at it, let's make sure we actually rename these new shapes and put them in their appropriate layers. So this would be the sender avatar. And then over here, we have our various recipients. So we'll just say recipient avatar. And I'm just going to copy this text and we'll put it in each of the other layers. So I'm going to hit Control or Command R to rename, and we'll paste that in to each of these following layers. And now with these, we can group these and rename it to be recipients. And let's see where within the message detail, the current message group, where these layers should go. So let's drag this down. So we have message sender. This actually goes, the avatar goes in front of that. And we have our recipients. We actually created a group for that. Let's make sure that the naming convention is consistent here. So let's say this is message, sender is the component, and then we'll add name to this subcomponent there. Now the recipients, let's pop open this group here and drag in the recipient avatars here. We'll say recipients. This will be the avatars group, and then we'll have the avatars inside of there. And lastly, we'll create a new group, and this will be recipients. This will be the tooltip for a specific recipient, actually. So this might even be nested within our recipients group here. And we can always finesse this further once we componentize things. I'm just trying to keep things roughly organized so we don't get too confused about where everything is. This tooltip we can pop in to come after our recipient that's kind of in an active hover state here. And let's turn our attention to creating the tooltip itself. So let's drag out that rectangle to match the body of the tooltip. Rename it to tooltip body or tooltip plate to be a little more consistent with the rest of our design. And let's add the border radius. I think it's a 2 pixel border radius by the look of it. So let's make sure that gets committed. And then let's color sample the background color that we need. Okay, that's looking good. Let's get this triangle for the caret of the tooltip in place. So we'll go down to our polygon tool in the upper drop down and drag out a triangle of the rough dimension we need. I'm going to establish the border radius first. It looks like it's probably a 2 pixel corner radius, I should say. And then from here, we'll want to stretch this out to look correct. We'll probably have to bring the height up a little bit, just so the corner radius is only shown on that top edge. Looks like we can go a little bit wider with this. 25, maybe 24 seems to be correct there. And we'll grab that same color. We're going to leave this as a separate shape just for now, because when it comes time to build this out in CSS, we actually will have a pseudo element for the caret and then just apply a background to the tooltip. So it actually will be 2 elements instead of a flattened shape or vector. So let's rename this to tooltip and we'll say caret. Grab these 2, drag this into our tooltips layer and make sure it comes beneath the actual recipient name and their title. That's looking good. Very quickly, I'm just going to turn on our, or turn off our reference, I should say, to double check on what we're building. It's looking good. And so now with this tooltip roughed out, let's see what else we need to add to our design. So if I turn on our reference, you can see that we have this kind of helper suggestion highlight for action items that are within the message body. And so here we say meeting tomorrow at 10, and we can conveniently add this as a reminder to our calendar. So let's get this kind of highlighted state established and then finish out the tooltip for the reminder text. So on top of our message body, we're going to add a rectangle for the background of this highlight. We're going to have to zoom in here. It's going to be a very faint color difference, so we're going to have to definitely check things at a pretty zoomed level here. And then let's adjust our corner radius to match. Looks like a pretty decent corner radius, probably around 6 pixels. I'm going to shift this down and sample that background color. Again, these are all temporary colors until we get things fully componentized. I'm going to rename this layer to be a highlight. This will be the plate. let's drag this to be just above the message body, which we're going to duplicate temporarily. And we're going to call this the message highlight. I'm going to turn off our reference layer just for a second here, as well as the message body beneath it. And we're going to actually edit this text to only include the string that we want to be part of that highlight. So meeting tomorrow at 10, I believe, is the full string that we'll need. We can double click the corner of this to auto size that paragraph text, and then we can move it in place. If we turn our message body back on and disable this plate temporarily, we can move our highlight to be exactly where we want it to be. And now if we turn that plate back on and adjust its positioning, we can start getting everything aligned as needed. So one thing I want to reference in the original design, it looks like we include the period in there. So I'll want to make sure our highlight has that as well. We're going to have to keep going back between our reference layer and our actual design, just because the typography varies a bit in its layout. And so we'll have to rough it in and approximate it as best we can. So looking at our reference, it looks like there's probably 2 pixel padding on the left and right, 2 to 3 pixel padding on the left and right there for our typography. So we'll turn off our reference layer, and then let's grab our plate, align it exactly with the typography, and then add, let's say 3 pixels on the sides. So we'll do the same thing with our period, 1, 2, 3. That's looking good, nice and centered. And then one last time, we're going to grab our text. We're going to color sample our fill. You can actually turn on the reference layer while we're sampling this to select the fill that we're looking for. And then we'll also want to have a 1 pixel tall border at the bottom, or text decoration basically, that has that same fill. We'll turn off our reference layer, get this aligned underneath it. And adjust it so it meets the edge of our typography. So we'll call this the message highlight, and this will be the bottom border. Drag this to follow the message highlight text, which we can rename to be a little more specific. And let's group these all together as message highlight. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Next up, we'll bring our reference back together for a moment so we can recreate the tooltip. Similar process as above, just quickly get our plate established. And obviously this would be a good candidate for a component that gets reused as needed, which we'll address soon. So again, this is the tooltip plate. And then we'll grab the same caret that we used above for the recipients. Just temporarily copying things, but we'll componentize things shortly here. We'll paste that above, get it in position where we need it. That's looking good. Grab these two, and we'll pull them down to the add to reminder section and make sure they come beneath the actual add to reminder text. Disable our preview here. And now we can take this whole add to reminder section, now that we've referenced the design accordingly, and get it centered within this highlight plate. We're actually going to have to drag this above the highlight to replicate the stacking that we'd expect. Okay, things are looking pretty good. I think I need to adjust this border to the highlight real quick. That's looking nice. Cool, and I think that looks good and matches our design well. All right, what else do we have left to recreate? It looks like we need to get our attachment previews in place, and then we'll drag in some additional avatars. And I think that'll take care of the initial draft of our design. So very quickly, I'm going to drag out a couple plates for these attachment previews. I think we'll call them. It should be 64 by 64. Looks like that's 1 pixel off, but we'll make sure to keep that nice and consistent. And then again, things aren't quite circular, so I think 24 pixel boarded radius looks correct. So let's call this our attachment preview. And maybe we'll call this the image variation there, because we have a PDF version just to the right here. So we'll drag out that same plate, shift it down. We can quickly color sample what we have here. And actually, I'm going to move this out of the way for now, and we'll have this inner piece. And instead of doing a stroke to replicate this outer color, you can see that there's actually a drop shadow on both layers to give it more dimensionality. So that's why I'm building it out with 2 rectangles instead. So we'll match the dimensions here. 54 by 54. Get the border radius to match. Looks like 18. Yeah, I think 18 works well for our needs. So I'm going to grab this and shift it down. Let's color sample once more. Put it back in place. Bring the bottom plate up. So we'll call this attachment preview. This will be PDF top plate. And then we'll rename the lower to be PDF bottom plate. I'm going to turn these off for just a moment here so we can bring in some text that has the extension name. Let's change the fill to match and see if we have a type spec already provided that matches what we need here. So we have source medium 14. Let's see how this looks. I'm going to center this text as well. That's looking pretty close. We might need a new type spec for this use case, but let's check it out. I think I like medium 16. So we'll quickly say source, medium, and 16 will be our new text style. So source, medium, and then 16. All right, we'll get this in place. I think one thing we have to do real quick actually is adjust the line height of this. Now with line height, since this is only on a single line, we could just set it to be the same value as the font size, but I think it's good to always expect things to wrap or that we might reuse this type spec in other places. So let's just type out a couple characters, and then what we can do is if we zoom out and check out the type spec on its own, we can adjust the line height here. So let's say 18 pixels as a start and just get it dialed in until we like what we see. So I'm going to turn off the reference layer just to avoid any distractions real quick. And again, we'll have to select the type spec directly. Sorry for the confusion as we go back and forth here. I think 18 pixels looks pretty good for the line height. Yeah, I think we'll want to keep it there for readability in case this actually was being used as more of a body copy type spec. So with that, we can take out the unnecessary characters, get it back to PDF. Let's bring our reference back in place and the plates that are beneath it. And then we'll want to center this up visually within the shapes that we created. So this renamed layer can be attachment, preview, PDF, and let's call it file type. And we'll rename this whole group to be attachment preview PDF. All right, to finish this specific component off, we can get the box shadows in place. So I'm going to move this whole thing to the side for now. And this first plate, we need to replicate this dark blue box shadow for the first layer. So we'll add an effect. It's automatically going to be drop shadow. Let's color sample what we see here to our best ability. Even though we're going to have to adjust this a fair bit, I'm going to move this design over for a second. Looks like the blur is pretty significant. And the Y spread is probably a little bit stronger. Looks like the X might actually be a negative value. Or perhaps we'll have to affect the blur a little bit here. Okay, that's looking pretty good with a blur of 5. I think I'm going to bump it to 6. And let's shift that opacity down just a little bit so it's not quite as strong. Okay, I think that looks good. 85% opacity, a Y displacement, and a blur of 6. Next up, we'll grab that bottom plate, add another effect, drop shadow. Let's see if we have a color we can reference here. Blur looks pretty small on this, so probably around an 8, I would say. The Y displacement is actually pretty tight, so probably around a 3 or 4. Okay, so let's do a blur of 8, a Y displacement of 4, and then adjust our opacity down just a little bit here. I think we might actually be okay leaving it pretty high. Maybe around 90%. And we can always adjust these colors in the future. So we'll grab our attachment preview. This is still within the current message. We have our attachment section. So we'll group these together and say message attachment previews. Drag this down. And if we turn off our reference, we'll want to get things aligned as needed and rearrange these layers accordingly. So I actually need to check out the reference once more. Maybe what we can do is just turn off layers beneath it. So we can spot check its positioning. Looks like we're just 1 pixel off there. Lastly, I'm going to grab this image attachment preview and just drag it out to the right. Cool, just getting everything restored here. We take a look at our reference design one last time. We just have to address these small avatars, and then we'll actually be all set with the recreation of this design. So let's zoom in here and create these small avatars. It looks like there's going to be a slight variation, even though they share styling in terms of their dimension and border radius. We have this light variation for the sender we're replying to. So once again, let's drag out with the rectangle tool the shape that we're looking for at the right dimension. Looks like this is 25 pixels in each dimension. Let's get that border radius in place, probably around a 10. Add a stroke. This will be on the outside, 1 pixel. Let's grab this whole shape, shift it down, color sample that border radius. Get that back in place. This is looking good. So this will be part of our reply section. So we can open up these layers and check out how we name things in the past. So this is the reply. This will be the recipient avatar. and drag it down to be just next to the recipient. That looks good if we disable that layer. Next up, we'll need to tackle these additional recipient avatars. So we'll grab that same thing we just created, copy it over, and if we turn off our reference layer, I think the only thing we'll need to do is get that border color established. I'm going to drag this up above our reference layer real quick, just so we can color sample conveniently. And from here, just drag out duplicate instances for each of the recipients. Looking at this, it looks like they might have a slightly different dimension and maybe a slightly different border radius, which is a little bit of an inconsistency. So I'm just going to constrain the width and height and see that these were 26 pixels in each dimension. I'm going to turn off the stroke temporarily just to make sure we match that border radius. So it looks like 26 and 10 is the intended dimension of these. Very quickly, I'm going to remove these other ones, drag out these corrected instances. And then what I think I'm going to do is come over to the recipient avatar. We drag these down and turn off our reference layer. I'm going to make this 26 by 26 as well, just so everything is nice and consistent. And with that centered up and in place, if we now zoom out completely in our design, you can see that we're missing the actual images. But if we look at the overall design elements and toggle between our reference layer, we should have pretty much everything in place. I think the finishing touch for this episode is let's get the box shadows for the reply and active message plates in place, and that'll kind of give us a preview of how we'll handle elevations or creating depth in our design. Additionally, it does look like we had some box shadows on these image attachment previews, so let's get those fixed up and then finalize things with these larger box shadows. So message detail, drill down into our current message, find our attachment preview layer, and I think we'll temporarily drag this above our reference just for convenience real quick. What I'm going to do is just shift these up a bit, and with both of these preview images, I'm going to add the drop shadow effect. We can quickly color sample things as needed. Adjust the blur a bit, as well as the opacity, take that down so it's not quite as strong. Okay, I think I like a blur of 8, a wide displacement of 8, and 90% opacity. Now if we were to shift these down to match the original position, drag them back down into their respective area and turn off our reference layer, I think everything is looking pretty good. Next up, let's turn our attention to this reply section for the overall box shadow we need. Again, I'm going to drag it above the reference layer for convenience, turn that back on. Go to the reply plate, zoom in quite a bit here, add a drop shadow effect. Now the blur on this would be pretty substantial, and I think I'm going to darken this box shadow just so we can see what's going on here. And the Y as well would be pretty strong overall. So let's just see how much blur we'd need for this effect. I think I'm going to go with around 64 pixels of blur. And maybe not as much Y displacement because I don't want it to spill out on the sides as much. Now if we turn off our reference layer, we can kind of see what we have going on here. Another thing we can do is toggle off our reply. We'll have to kind of compare the two. I think we've captured that overall feel of elevation pretty well with that so far. So this is kind of a first pass on how our box shadows should look. We'll drag that back down in place. And then lastly, let's tackle this active message. So in our inbox, let's grab this message active, drag it above the reference, just so we can color sample again. Let's grab the plate, add the drop shadow, sample things quickly. This is going to be pretty subtle, I'm imagining. Doesn't have too strong of a blur, I don't believe. And our Y might actually look pretty good here. I think I'm going to keep it around 4. Again, let's darken this box shadow and then change the opacity to better replicate what was probably originally designed here. I think I'm going to up the blur a bit, maybe to 20 or so. And let's just turn off the reference here to get a feel for where we're at. Looks like we actually need a little more blur. It's maybe up to 32. Now that's a pretty decent first pass on that box shadow as well. So we'll drag that back down in the correct layer position. Now if we zoom out and check things out, one thing we can do very quickly is take this reference layer and let's just drag it out so it falls outside of the artboard. And then we can kind of just visually compare between the two. Overall, I think we've captured the feel of what we're going for. I think these box shadows are maybe a little bit too strong if we look at things from this distance. So let's quickly adjust the opacities on these. Maybe knock it down to around 60 or so. Maybe down to 50 would be better. That's looking good. Our active message is definitely looking a little bit strong here. I think I'll also keep that around 40% opacity. Now if we look at things, I think overall the balance, the shapes of everything, and the elevation that we just established honors our design pretty faithfully. So we can remove this temporary reference that we used just at this stage of the process. And now I think we're well set up to start componentizing all the different elements of our UI and iterating over this to bring in consistent spacing using the spacing components that we've established, and start thinking through having sufficient color contrast throughout the UI, narrowing our palette down to a more manageable set, as well as determining how many type specs we actually really need. So I think that does it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching, and be sure to check out the next episode where we'll start building out Figma components for all of the UI elements you see here and start planning for the actual development process of this project. Thanks again for watching, and be sure to keep a lookout for upcoming episodes.